When 18-year-old Anna Sophia Tertia stepped aboard the Titanic from the Southampton dock on that April morning, it was almost a world away from her former life. To her, the ship was as large as a city. Steerage was always a lively affair with singing and dancing, each person, like her, hoping to create a new life in a new land. As she was older, her steerage ticket meant that she was in the ladies-only section of the ship and shared her room with two other women. One was with her two children, while the other was travelling with her brother, but due to third-class restrictions, he had to stay in another part of the ship. Late Sunday night, Anna was in her bed when her cabin mate's brother knocked on the door and told them to wrap up warm and grab the life jackets. Something was wrong, he warned. We need to get to the lifeboats. And he ushered them upstairs. When Anna reached the boat deck, it was full of people, and all were moving towards the boats. But in the midst of the crowd, Anna saw a group of men file out of the room, and the doors were locked behind them. They carried instruments, and while the growing unease turned into chaos, they played. Anna would survive that night, but the memory of the band playing as the ship sank from under them would forever be ingrained, so much so that the band became as famous as the ship itself. The 8-piece orchestra was not in fact White Star Line employees, but were hired specifically for the voyage. Theodore Brayley was the group's pianist and was born near London in 1887. He loved music and started to learn the piano from an early age. His talent saw him in the Royal Lancashire Fusiliers Regiment, and he was employed as a musician. He stayed in that role until 1907, where he left and joined an agency. Agencies were, and still are, the best way for musicians to find work, and it only took a few months for his first gig on a ship. The ship, Saxonia, was a large and well-established ship and was used for Cunard for transatlantic crossings. Afterward, he was delighted to be also picked for the Carpathia. While on board, he met fellow musician Roger Bicot. The two men enjoyed each other's company, and after the Carpathia docked, the men went to the White Star Line as their latest ship, Titanic, was looking for musicians. The men applied, and the White Star Line obliged. Roger Bicot was young, only 20 when he boarded Titanic, but his skills as a cellist was one of the best on the scene. He was born in France, and he was born into music. His parents moved him to Monaco, where he was sent to Italy to continue his studies, before heading to the UK to play in hotels in Leeds. He moved between the UK and France, before taking a job on the Carpathia. There he met Theodore Brayley, and together the men looked to Titanic, and the White Star Line welcomed them on board. Jock Hume was born in Dumfries, and while his upbringing wasn't as rich as Roger's, Jock's talents for the violin shone. Jock was well experienced, and when he was selected for the Titanic, having worked on ships before. At 21 he got on well with the others, being at a similar age, and to him the ship was his pinnacle of his career. George Crins didn't at first want to go into music. Instead, he wanted to go into the army. His family, though, seeing how good he was with a violin, disagreed and persuaded him to go in furthering his talent. The family was born and bred in Belgium, and George even won awards for his music as his skills developed. He moved to Paris to pay for the Parisian theatres, but soon he moved to London to play at the Ritz Hotel, and was working there right up until March 1912. As he was also an accomplished bandmaster, he was a natural choice for the new liner. John Clark was one of the older members of the orchestra and was born near Manchester. Like many of the others, he grew up around music. He worked briefly as an insurance clerk before he went back to his first love, his violin. Working up the ranks, he ended up in the Liverpool Philharmonic Band. While in Liverpool, he was approached by the agency for additional work, and it wasn't long before he was on a train headed to Southampton docks and the waiting Titanic. Percy Taylor was the oldest person in the orchestra at aged 40. He lived in London, and after his father passed, he helped his mother as a shop clerk. he met local girl Clara Talbot, and the pair married by 1910. However, the marriage was problematic and the pair separated a year later. Unusually, despite his talent, he had very few musical appointments, but through the agency he was good enough to be selected for the Titanic. It was likely it was his first time Percy had ever boarded a ship. John Wesley Woodward was born not too far from Percy and was the baby of the family of 10. Preferring that his friends call him Wesley, he picked up a cello and his talent was set. He moved around hotels playing for the gentry, but at Eastbourne he started to get noticed by crews, especially from the White Star Line. He joined the crews, eventually joining fellow musicians. In April 1912, he was on the Southampton dockside, ready to board. The bandmaster, violinist and leader of the orchestra was Wallace Hartley. Wallace was born in Lancashire, and his father worked with the church, and many of the hymns Wallace used he learned to play growing up. He was taught the violin by a fellow member of the flock, and got so good he found himself in the Huddersfield Orchestra. He worked from hotels to concert halls all across Yorkshire. Like many, he learnt that his music was perfect for the new cruise liners, and joined Cunard before moving to Titanic through the same agency. So the 8 stood on the docks, all staring up in awe at the massive ship. Now all 8 men had been given second-class tickets. For effective crew, this was unusual, but as the men needed the extra room for the instruments, it was the best choice. To cover the required music, the ensemble split into 2, one a quintet led by Wallace and the other a trio led by George. Friends Roger and William accompanied George and would play light music in the cafe and the a la carte restaurant. Wallace and his quintet took on most of the work. This included the church services where Wallace's knowledge of hymns was used, and they played at lunch and tea time. They also played in the smoking rooms and in after-dinner concerts to the delight of the guests. Being second class, they received fantastic service and would play requests and light music as the passengers ate. It was not known what the men were doing at the time of the iceberg strike, but as the men's room was adjacent, it was likely that Wallace gathered them together. From eyewitnesses' accounts, they were spotted on the boat deck and started to play to ease the growing panic. The songs were upbeat music, but as the situation became more dire, it was said that the songs matched the mood, and Wallace led the way with hymns he had learnt. Although no one can be sure, the eyewitness testimony claimed that the last song heard was the famous hymn "Nearer My God to Thee," a hymn that has now become infamous with the sinking. Not one of the 8 musicians survived that night. 2 weeks later, when the Mackie Bennett arrived amongst the debris and the bodies, Wallace was found, along with his violin in its case, probably the very last act he performed before he died. He was still dressed in his best. Jock was also recovered nearby, but everyone else was lost. Roger Bicou, however, was not officially listed among the dead. Instead, the French listed him as missing, even calling him a deserter after failing to report to the French armed forces at the start of World War I. It took 88 years to legally declare him dead, making him the very last Titanic victim to be declared. The story of the orchestra's bravery reached home before the men did, and in a rare move, Wallace's body was taken back to the UK. Jock's family sadly couldn't afford the cost to bring Jock home, so he was buried as a hero with many of the victims in Halifax. Jock's father would receive further insult as days after the news, he received a bill from the agency, an invoice for the lost uniform. Understandably, this remained unpaid. Wallace was buried in Keighley Road Cemetery in Colne, close to his home, with over 40,000 people lining the streets for his funeral, and to the locals he is a true hero. The act of the orchestra that night gave a new and human dimension to the disaster. It distinguished the era, and many films give credit to the orchestra. It was a rare defining moment, and one many can imagine in the horror that the band played on.